Hello and welcome to the next series of videos that focuses on topic 1. And I'm sure you've already realized that this topic is quite a large one with lots to learn and lots of materials with which to engage with to learn about the teaching profession and all the various aspects that make it up. This series will concentrate on one of the core readings of topic 1, and I feel one of the most critical readings in the unit as a whole, Teaching Making a Difference, Chapter 2, Historical Insights into Teaching. Now, I have to say that this particular chapter, 40 pages or so, including the references at the end, is quite a marvelous introduction for you to engage with and to learn from. And I feel this particular chapter requires much returning to, in that you can skim it and get the main points from the outset, but I feel that in order to gain the most you can from this particular resource, you should be returning to it at least a few times throughout this semester. So let's begin. I'm going to skip past the first few pages and the little opening case they talk about. It's worthwhile thinking about and imagining yourself in this situation, but I'm going to just focus on highlighting what I feel are some critical elements and just some of my thoughts around that, and again in general talk about the usefulness of this resource. It's interesting to note that from the outset the text cites and continues to cite the professional teaching standards in Australia, the ATEL standards as a whole. They do this, I think, because they need to. It's an education textbook to be sold at universities and to be taken up by universities. And the universities are currently being shaped by the ATEL standards. In fact, the very course in which you are learning, and this unit obviously as well, aligns with the standards in a very, very clear and empirical way. So although the content of this chapter, if you have read it, talks about a critical approach to all of the teaching profession and thinking through theory, thinking about how we consider what makes up teaching, etc., they still, I think they minimize their criticism of the standards, and it's obvious why. There's elsewhere that you can read about the standards and a critical view of those, and in the notes to this video I'll just paste a couple of links there for you if you're interested in that. But from my reading, I feel that they're really trying their best not to be too critical of the standards, because they know that they have to be a bit more balanced. But anyway, let's skim to here one of the first pages they describe, and this particular highlighted section here about this notion of schools not working especially well, and they describe about the very blunt, I guess, message that schools are essentially failing large numbers of students, and that those groups that are already marginalized are being have things even worse off when it comes to education, disadvantage, etc. So it's a pretty blunt, as I said, it's a pretty realistic way in some senses, or certainly no optimism in that paragraph there in terms of what is really going on in education in our country. Is it doing well? Is it not doing so well? Is it patchy? Is there sites of where really it is working fantastically well, sites where there's not? What causes that? Why are some schools particularly failing? So that prompts our question there in terms of, you can look at that and you can feel defeated by it, or you can say, hang on a minute, what is the picture? Is it, what is going on? What is my role in all of that? So I think it's important that we face this fact that school does fail large numbers of students in our country. So, why does that happen? What can we do about that? And so forth. If we skim down here, this is an interesting activity to do, and I recommend that you do it. Again, it's encouraged as well in Marsh in a certain way, but I think it's interesting how we think about this production of a list about what good classrooms and good teaching is, and what does it reflect when you consider this idea. And this notion of reflecting normalized practice is really important to understand and get your head around, because really this threads itself, it's the way through this whole chapter, the ways in which we take for granted certain kinds of knowledge that pertains to what does it mean to be a good and effective teacher, what are good and effective students, and schools in more general. How do we classify good, competent, effective, productive, whatever word you want to use. So this practice as usual issue. So what is practice as usual? Think about then, are there limitations of this in terms of, if we follow the taken for granted road, we say, well, this works, this has always worked, this is how we usually do things, so there's no point doing something else. The authors are saying, well, can we develop a critical perspective in that mode? And we can't. We've actually, in fact, got to see it for what it is, as this normalized practice that maybe we need to disrupt in order to meet the problem set forth that, hey, schooling is failing a lot of kids. So how do we then reshape things, change things, do things differently, think about things differently in order to tackle this very big problem? So they go on to describe the value of a critical perspective, which is very important. And I'm just now going to skim down to this next section about this notion that schools are really these incredibly formal institutions, and they that is their history. They've always, not always, but for a long time in the modern age certainly, they have been under the auspice, under the responsibility of government, but also community and different groups, but certainly on the whole, government has made for a long time always strong claims on what education should be and how it should work, and the critical nature of education. If we look at the present moment and you look at the discourse that is going on about education politically, and there's lots of interested groups there that contribute to that discussion, not just government, but that, this, it's given a lot of importance, and there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of opinion, there's a lot of back and forth around best practice. What does that mean? What's working in other countries at the moment? Applying that here to raise standards, ensuring that we are building productive citizens that they can engage and tackle with the problems of the future. All of that stuff. The economy, technology. You hear that saying that kids in primary school, that there's jobs that haven't been invented for them yet. So in terms of how quickly the labour force is evolving, changing, fracturing, all of that. So you have to see schools as being intimately connected with governing and governing a population, ensuring that the transmission of values is aligns with national interest. All of that stuff. It's all wrapped up in there. So this next section here that I wanted to highlight talks about the history of schooling in Australia, and it can be applied to a lot of the Western world, developing along 4 distinct purposes. So reasons why, we can chart the schooling of the history of schooling in our country, as being the forces shaping that story, is that, number one, ensuring social and political stability, very important. I was just mentioning that. Number two, building a national culture, alluded to that in terms of that transmission of values. Contributing to the economy, again, this notion of productive citizens, productive workforce, productive economy, strong economy, all of that stuff. And number four, enabling social, cultural, and economic improvement on the part of individual parents and students, contributing to the development of well-being as young people. So the first there, this kind of free education at the point of delivery, what Ken Robinson talked about, that in that video, it's social engineering, and in good ways. It's not always bad. It's also good for governments to do social engineering. It just has to be the right kind. And then the second part of this point, I think, is also quite important to acknowledge, and this ties in with the research I'm doing at the moment in terms of emotions and well-being, and it's talked about a lot for teachers, but as well the well-being of young people, and you see this certainly now in terms of LGBT rights. That's important. There's bullying that goes on as well, obviously more generally. There's also the sense of mental health awareness, even in very young people. So all of that, the government is intensely interested in. This is a fantastic table to just get an overview of the different kinds of governance and the focuses of that governance at different time periods in Australia. So really great table there in summary. And just here, I thought it was quite interesting point of how long that we have really. It's not just right now where there's this over focus on testing and standardization. It dates back to as they say, the early 1900s, where this labor kind of focus around the economy and society and education and all of that. And obviously the 1950s with the post-World War II boom, this idea that there was a huge upsurge in population, many more children to educate. So how do we make the most of this surge? How do we put them to work in various ways that were evolving in the 1950s? And as well, obviously, production, manufacturing was so important then too. So how do we funnel, workers that can be on the factory floor and, be safe and ensure that they, do their job efficiently and all that sorts of things. But that this trend in terms of that economic social engineering has been boosted by these comparisons we have to measure ourselves between states and populations, and as well the comparisons internationally and in the globalized context that we now are existing in terms of what's happening with student learning. So, there is a very, very strong focus on that, and we are constantly compared with countries in our region because there's an economic imperative to that. So Singapore, South Korea is thrown in there, obviously China, Japan, etc. So those, when they do the big scale testing, it is there that they go, okay, what is going on with our reading and writing, with our mathematics, with our science, all of those things, and how do we compare, how do students compare at different ages in our country with students at different ages in other countries, and who bubbles to the surface. We're currently sitting probably, near the top, but not at the top, and that's, quite a point of ire in the government. And you hear Simon Birmingham certainly talk about this ad nauseum, this notion of competition, and that we're lagging behind like it's some sort of race, 100-meter dash to see who gets there first. And obviously you can tell from the tone of my speech and what I'm saying that I'm very critical of all of those kinds of comparisons. So if we move on and just come down here, just because this is again another very good summary table of the text in detail above of, from a historical point of view in our country, the kinds of stakeholders that have influenced, I guess, education and the who speak for education. So it's important again to get your head around and how the media kind of plays into that, certainly families, etc. So how has this sort of shifted and where has been the focus? It's important to understand those kinds of forces in schools. So we move over to governance, of which I'm very focused in my own theoretical work and research. I think you cannot separate governance from schooling and education more generally. I set that out in the introductory YouTube videos for topic 1, the first series, where I focused Marsh's comment from the very outset that teaching is a political act, and governance as political acts are entwined with schooling, again, in all levels, even in the private sphere. So this talks about how that very point that classrooms are part of this larger organizational structure of governance. So policies, regulations, procedures. So again, I just want to make clear that when I talk about government, so government of the day, the current level government, obviously they don't, the state doesn't just have influence on public schools, although they have much greater influence on public schools, obviously. But in the private sector, yes, there's all different kinds of schools, private schools, with all different kinds of affiliations, religious. There's alternative philosophy schools, which this particular chapter talks about at the end. Montessori is one example. Reggio Emilia is another. Steiner is another. There are others. But those privately run, or private in terms of full fee-paying schools, however you want to think about that, they are still under the administration of government and have to adhere to a whole host of different kinds of regulations around what they do and how they do it. And obviously their teachers in each state must still be registered by the Teacher Registration Board in order to teach. So yeah, there's, of course, just to spell it out, how governance finds its way into all aspects of education in our country. So if we go here again, just a small section that I've just focused on about the different developments in education, and tracing that historical story. Focusing on governance here is a good point about the mode of governance. So from indirect, so largely dependent on market forces, and the intensity of governance. So that I guess talks about, in a sense, so what mode is governance within education taking, to what scale of intensity is it taking? And you can look at local science, you can look at changes that have occurred more broadly over time. So if you're thinking about governance in education, that is a good way to think about it. So what mode is governing taking in this particular example, or force or aspect of education, and then how intense has that role of governance been within that particular thing you are looking at. I'm just going to pause it here briefly before the next video starts.